At 2:14 in the morning on July 10, 1943, Lieutenant Jack Churchill made a choice that should have gotten him killed instantly, the kind of choice no sane officer would ever make. He stood there staring across open ground at a fortified German position holding 40, 2 soldiers with machine guns, mortars, and interlocking fire that could cut a man into pieces before he made 10 steps. His orders were blunt: take that position before sunrise with only 8 men. Every manual, every British training lecture, every rule of warfare declared this impossible. Yet Churchill's answer was something no commander could have predicted. He decided to walk straight toward the Germans alone, carrying only his Scottish broadsword and playing the bagpipes like he was marching onto a parade field instead of into certain death. No covering fire, no smoke screens, no diversionary attack. Just the sound of his pipes drifting through the dark and the silhouette of a lone British officer advancing into the jaws of a machine gun nest. 7 minutes later, every single one of those 42 German soldiers surrendered without firing a single bullet. To understand how Churchill pulled off something that defied logic, you have to go back 2 years, to the moment he realized that the sword on his back was more than an eccentric keepsake. His real battle wasn't with the Germans that night. It was with British doctrine that insisted modern war had no place for old weapons. In June 1941, during a coastal raid in France, Churchill's unit, No. 2 Commando, crept toward a German observation post. The mission was simple on paper: slip in quietly, eliminate the sentries with knives, destroy their communications, and slip back out before reinforcements arrived. It was pitch black, the moon covered, the perfect setting for a silent kill. Churchill moved within 20 meters of a German guard, lifted his Thompson submachine gun, the standard weapon for British commandos, dependable and lethal at close range. He squeezed the trigger. Nothing but a dull click, a jam. The German turned, eyes locking on Churchill, rifle rising fast. Churchill had maybe 2 seconds before the man fired and alerted the entire garrison. 2 seconds before the mission collapsed and every man in his unit died. He didn't think or strategize. He acted on instinct. On his back was a Scottish broadsword he'd brought from England because he liked how it looked, a decorative relic with no place in modern combat. But in that instant, it became the only weapon he had. Churchill drew it in one fluid motion, muscle memory flashing from years ago when he had trained in stage combat as a young actor. The German's finger tightened on his trigger, but Churchill closed the gap in 3 quick steps. One precise swing. The blade sliced across the German's chest, dropping him instantly, his rifle clattering on stone. Churchill froze for a heartbeat, staring at the sword streaked with blood, realizing he had just killed a man using a weapon that hadn't been truly used in war for 2 centuries. Sergeant Davies, watching in disbelief, whispered, "Sir." "What in the hell was that?" Churchill wiped the blade on the German's uniform, said nothing, and continued the mission. Everything succeeded as planned, but from that moment on, the sword never left his side. Not because he wanted to be dramatic or strange, but because he had discovered something the manuals never mentioned: that modern weapons made soldiers predictable. Every German infantryman trained to fight opponents armed with rifles, grenades, machine guns. They knew the distances, the sounds, the tactics. They knew exactly how to counter them. But nobody is trained to respond to a man charging at them with a medieval sword in the middle of a 20th century battlefield. That gap between expectation and reality, that was the ground where Churchill thrived. Over the next 2 years, Churchill killed 20, 3 German and Italian soldiers in close quarters, 11 of them with the broadsword, the rest with a longbow he later adopted. But even those kills weren't the real weapon. The real weapon was what happened inside the enemy's mind the moment they saw him. By late 1942, German intelligence noticed an unsettling pattern. Reports from Norway, France, and Italy mentioned British commandos leaving behind bodies not just from gunfire but from deep blade wounds. Some victims were nearly decapitated. Survivors who lived long enough to talk described a tall British officer who charged them with bagpipes, a longbow, and a sword, shouting as he closed the distance, They called him Mad Jack. They weren't entirely wrong. He was bold, reckless, and terrifying. But madness wasn't what kept him alive. Churchill understood fear, not from military textbooks, but from his years as a performer. On stage, he had learned 3 truths. People respond to what they expect. Breaking that expectation at the perfect moment creates shock, and committing fully, without hesitation, sells the illusion. Churchill carried those lessons into battle. German soldiers expected stealth, cover, and tactics. Churchill broke every rule deliberately. He walked upright in the open, exposed, announcing himself with bagpipes, wielding a weapon that shouldn't exist on a battlefield filled with automatic fire. And because he committed completely, no hesitation, no fear, he created 3 seconds of paralysis in enemy minds. 3 seconds where training failed and confusion took over. 3 seconds that turned impossible situations into victories. But on July 10th, 1943, those 3 seconds weren't enough on their own. To defeat 42 Germans with only 8 commandos, Churchill needed more than a sword. He needed them to see something that wasn't there. He needed them to believe an army was coming. And that belief began the moment he stepped out of the ditch and started walking toward the German line with his sword raised and his bagpipes ready to play. The Germans had never trained for what Churchill represented, and that was exactly why he survived. They had manuals for British rifle tactics, for countering grenades, for defending against commando raids. But they had no doctrine for a man who stormed toward them carrying a broadsword, as if he belonged to another century. That disconnect between what soldiers expect and what they actually see became Churchill's most effective battlefield weapon. Over the next 2 years, he killed 3 German and Italian soldiers in close combat, 11 with that sword, and others with the longbow he eventually added to his kit. Another weapon modern troops had no psychological framework to interpret. But the body count was never the real story. The real force he wielded was the shock his presence created inside enemy minds. By late 1942, the German army began noticing strange reports coming from occupied territories. Raids where men were found with deep cuts instead of bullet wounds. Where survivors spoke of a tall British officer charging with a sword raised high. Where bagpipes echoed moments before. Positions fell. Wehrmacht intelligence compiled these accounts, cross-referenced wounds, and concluded that all these incidents pointed back to a single British officer. They gave him a name whispered with both fear and disbelief, the madman with the sword, or more famously, Mad Jack. What the Germans didn't understand was that Churchill wasn't insane at all. He was methodical in ways most officers never even considered. His understanding of fear didn't come from military training, but from his years as a stage actor before the war. On stage, he learned 3 rules that would shape every engagement he fought. The first was expectation. Audiences, like soldiers, respond based on what they think is supposed to happen. Give them exactly that, and they stay comfortable, predictable. The second was violation. Break one expectation at a precise moment, and you create a shock that seizes attention and disrupts thought. The third was commitment. If you choose to break expectations, you must do it without hesitation, because the moment you show doubt, the illusion collapses. Churchill carried these principles into battle. German soldiers expected commandos to behave tactically, move through shadows, use cover, fire first, advance behind smoke or automatic fire. Churchill violated those expectations by doing the opposite, walking in the open, making himself visible, lifting his sword high, playing bagpipes that echoed across the landscape, acting as though he had an entire battalion behind him even when he was alone. And because he committed with total confidence, the Germans hesitated. Their brains stalled, trying to categorize what they were seeing. That hesitation, those precious 3 seconds where reaction lagged behind shock, became the thin space where Churchill operated. But Churchill's brilliance wasn't only in how he disrupted enemy minds. It was also in how he used the unseen to amplify the illusion. On July 10, 1943, at 0200 hours, Churchill and his 8-man unit lay hidden inside a drainage ditch 400 meters from the German position they were ordered to seize before dawn. Intelligence had claimed the site held maybe a dozen soldiers, something an 8-man commando team could handle. But Churchill's reconnaissance an hour earlier revealed the truth. 2 Germans, machine gun nests dug in, mortar teams positioned with perfect range, and overlapping fields of fire that made the position nearly impregnable. His seconding command, Lieutenant Robert Malcolm, a 24-year-old fresh Sandhurst graduate, ran the numbers in his head and immediately concluded that assaulting a fortified position manned by 42 enemy troops with only 8 men was suicide. The manual said withdraw, request support, wait for artillery or reinforcements. Churchill ignored the manual and announced they were attacking anyway. Malcolm, who had served alongside Churchill for 6 months and witnessed him survive impossible situations, wanted to trust him. But even he hesitated. This wasn't a knife raid or a surprise ambush. This was a head-on approach toward a position designed to wipe out entire platoons. Churchill gathered his men, all veterans of multiple missions, all familiar with his unconventional methods. He outlined the plan with calm confidence. He would walk alone to the German position. Once he started playing the pipes, the rest of them would wait 30 seconds, then advance. Not running but walking, spread out, shouting commands to imaginary troops. They would create the soundscape of a battalion, strength assault. The Germans, hearing multiple voices and seeing Churchill advance openly, would assume a massive attack force was coming out of the darkness. Corporal James Henderson asked the question on everyone's mind, "Sir, what if they shoot you?" Churchill smiled without humor and said, "Then you retreat and tell headquarters I died as I live, improperly dressed for combat." No one laughed. They all understood the risk. Churchill checked his sword, the blade he had honed the previous night, not because he expected to use it, but because he believed preparation was part of commitment. Any half measure, any uncertainty, could break the illusion he needed to survive. He climbed out of the ditch, stood tall, adjusted his beret to the angle that annoyed senior officers, and began walking toward 42 armed Germans with only a sword and bagpipes. The first 100 meters were silent. The Germans hadn't spotted him yet. At 80 meters, a sentry saw movement and shouted. Other voices followed, confusion, questions, a single soldier approaching. Where were the rest? Churchill kept walking, steady and deliberate. At 60 meters, he heard machine gun barrels shifting toward him, metal scraping as German gunners took aim. Any rational man would have dived for cover. Churchill did the opposite. He lifted his sword higher, making himself an even bigger target. At 50 meters, he pulled out his bagpipes and began playing the March of the Cameron Men. The sound slicing through the dark like a challenge hurled straight into the enemy line. German voices fell silent. They stared at a man walking into their guns with music instead of fear, with a sword instead of a rifle. And behind Churchill in the ditch, Malcolm and the 7 commandos waited for their moment, ready to sell the illusion of an invisible army. Churchill counted the seconds in his head. 20 seconds since the pipes began. The deception was underway. Churchill's slow march toward the German strongpoint was only the first part of the deception. The second part depended entirely on what his men did in the darkness behind him. But before they could play their role, he had to sell the illusion completely on his own. 42 Germans waited ahead, and Churchill needed every one of them to believe the same lie, that he was not a lone officer but the tip of a massive British assault. An hour earlier, Churchill's reconnaissance had revealed the grim truth. The German position was a miniature fortress, equipped with machine gun nests dug into well-protected angles, mortar teams shadowed behind sandbags, and a neat overlapping web of fire that would cut down any normal assault force long before it reached the wire. Intelligence had been disastrously wrong. Instead of 12 defenders, the number was 42, each one positioned exactly where doctrine said they should be for maximum killing power. When Churchill returned to the ditch and delivered the count to his men, Lieutenant Robert Malcolm felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. Malcolm had learned the formulas, the ratios, the principles. An 8-man commando unit assaulting 40, 2 entrenched defenders was not a battle, it was an execution, and they would be the ones executed. The textbook answer was to retreat silently, request air or artillery support, rethink the mission, but Churchill dismissed retreat entirely. In his experience, doctrine became a trap if followed too strictly. The Germans expected British troops to behave according to their manuals, and that expectation made them predictable. If he wanted to win, he needed the Germans thinking anything except the truth. His men trusted him, but even seasoned commandos exchanged uneasy looks. Malcolm, though loyal, couldn't shake the cold math ticking inside his head. 8 against 40, 2. It simply didn't work, unless Churchill somehow found a way to make the enemy surrender before they fired. Churchill explained the plan. His plan, the only one that kept them alive. He would walk forward alone, in full view, carrying his sword and playing his pipes loudly enough for every German ear to hear. 30 seconds later, Malcolm and the rest would rise from the ditch and start moving forward. Not running but walking in formation, spread wide. Their silhouettes scattered enough to imply numbers far greater than 8. They would shout orders to troops that weren't their platoons, machine gun teams, flanking units, knowing the darkness would carry the echoes and hide their small numbers. The Germans would hear voices, not knowing how many men were actually behind them. They would see Churchill announcing himself boldly, and assume no sane officer would do that unless backed by overwhelming force. The illusion would settle into their minds before they had time to question it. When Corporal Henderson asked what they should do if the Germans simply shot Churchill, the lieutenant brushed the concern aside with a grim joke. If they killed him, retreat and say he died improperly dressed for battle. No one laughed because every one of them knew the risk was real. Churchill checked his sword, the blade gleaming faintly in the dark, sharpened meticulously the night before. He stepped out of the ditch as if walking onto a stage, straightened his beret with a casual motion only he could pull off in a war zone, and began his quiet march toward 40, 2 rifles waiting to cut him down. For the first 100 meters he was only a shadow crossing a field, but at 80 meters a German voice barked an alarm, another shouted back confused, more voices rose, a single figure, alone. Churchill walked steadily, the sword held high, the bagpipes silent until he was close enough for their sound to matter. At 60 meters, he heard the cold metal clicks of machine gun barrels pivoting toward him. German gunners were taking aim, but no bullets came yet. They were waiting for orders, waiting to understand what they were seeing. This was the fragile moment Churchill always depended on, the gap where soldiers' training did not match the reality in front of them. And then, at 50 meters, he gave them something even harder to process. He lifted the bagpipes and began to play. The sound tore across the field like a war cry from a forgotten century, the piercing notes slicing through the night air, echoing between ridges. Every German voice went silent. Even Malcolm and his men felt the shock ripple through the darkness. No one walked into machine gun fire playing bagpipes unless they had an entire army behind them. Churchill played without a tremor of fear, counting the seconds inside his head. 10 seconds, 15, 20. His men were crouched low, ready. German officers shouted fragmented orders. Search the field, check for additional forces, hold fire until more silhouettes appeared. They were already assuming a British battalion was hidden in the dark, advancing to overrun them. Churchill kept walking, his pace calm, deliberate, completely wrong for a man about to be shot. His confidence was the bait. His sword was the hook, his pipes were the fuse. The Germans' expectation of modern war, for rifles, grenades, tactical formations, was dissolving in real time. Their minds scrambled to match what they saw with something familiar, but nothing fit. Churchill reached 40 meters. The German voices grew louder, more urgent, but no one fired. They were too busy searching the blackness behind him for the battalion that must be moving up to support him. Churchill's march had forced them into a mental trap. If he wasn't afraid, he couldn't be alone. At the 30-second mark, Malcolm stood. His men rose with him. In the faint starlight, their silhouettes took shape, spaced out perfectly to mimic a far larger force. And then, following Churchill's precise timing, they began shouting orders into the darkness, naming imaginary platoons, calling for flanking maneuvers, demanding covering fire from invisible machine gun teams. Their voices carried across the field, bounced off stone and dirt, multiplied by echo into something far greater than 8 men. The Germans heard everything, the pipes, the footsteps, the commands, everything except the truth. And in that gap of misunderstanding, in that collapsing of trained expectations, Churchill found the advantage he needed to make 40. 2 armed soldiers doubt their own eyes. It was only the beginning, but the illusion was working. At 40 meters from the German line, the illusion Churchill had crafted began to take on a life of its own, feeding on fear, misunderstanding, and the rigid logic of soldiers who had been trained to expect the familiar. A German officer finally snapped from confusion into action, shouting orders for his men to prepare to engage, telling them to watch for additional forces. His voice a mixture of discipline and rising panic. But still no one fired. Their eyes were not fixed on Churchill alone. They were scanning the dark terrain behind him, searching for the dozens or hundreds of soldiers who had to be advancing. Churchill kept walking forward, his piping steady, his sword held high like a challenge carved out of history. Every footstep drove deeper into their minds the same impossible conclusion. This officer would not be doing this unless he commanded overwhelming support. Behind him, Malcolm and the other 7 commandos continued their slow advance, stretched out wide across the field, each one acting as though they were merely part of a much larger formation. Malcolm shouted, "Second platoon, advance on the left." Henderson answered with perfect timing, "Third platoon, covering fire on my mark." Another commando bellowed for machine gun teams to reposition. Their voices blended with echoes, bouncing off stone and grass until the Germans could no longer tell how many men were approaching. They heard at least 3 officers giving orders. They heard troops moving. They heard what sounded like multiple units coordinating an assault. But all of it was just 8 men stepping in rhythm with a madman playing pipes. At 30 meters, Churchill lowered the bagpipes, letting silence slam into the German trenches like a physical force. He lifted his sword again, its steel catching faint starlight, and locked eyes with the front line of startled young soldiers who had no idea what to do. Then he shouted in flawless German, "Surrender or die." His voice cracked through the confusion with brutal clarity. The German officer in charge, Lieutenant Klaus Reinhardt, had 3 seconds, just 3 to decide whether to fight or capitulate. Reinhardt was no soft recruit. At 28, he had survived Stalingrad, endured the bloodbath of the Eastern Front, and seen enough horror to carve a lifetime of scars inside his mind. He was courageous, disciplined, and far from easily intimidated. But what he saw now made no tactical sense. A lone British officer had walked across open ground toward machine guns, playing bagpipes, announcing his position, exposing himself deliberately. Behind him came officers giving orders to what sounded like multiple platoons. Every instinct screamed that this was the opening move of a full-scale assault meant to crush his fortified line. And he had only seconds before that phantom battalion, supposedly hiding in the dark, crashed down on them. Reinhardt weighed his options: resist and be slaughtered, or surrender and live. He chose life. With the sharp authority of a man who had seen enough war to recognize hopelessness, he commanded his men to drop their weapons. 2 Germans lowered their rifles, hands raised, faces pale with the realization that they had been outmaneuvered not by firepower, but by the audacity of one man with a sword. Churchill stepped over the lip of the trench, sword still pointed forward, his expression calm, almost bored, as though this outcome had been inevitable. Malcolm and the commandos came into view seconds later, their silhouettes emerging like shadows of the army that never existed. 8 soldiers walked into the trench to take the surrender of 42. Reinhardt stared at Churchill in disbelief, He spoke English, his voice shaking as he asked, "How many troops do you have behind you?" Churchill didn't respond. He maintained the sword at Reinhardt's throat and allowed the silence to deepen the illusion. Behind him, Malcolm shouted for imaginary machine gun teams to set positions, for reinforcements to hold their advance, maintaining the fiction until every German soldier was securely disarmed. Reinhardt risked a glance past Churchill, watching forms shift in the dark, shadows that could have been 8 men or 800. In fear, the mind does not count, it multiplies. In exactly 7 minutes, from the moment Churchill rose from the ditch to the instant the last German rifle hit the dirt, the battle ended without a single shot being fired. No British casualties, no German casualties. Just a complete psychological collapse triggered by one man violating every expectation the enemy possessed. As Malcolm organized the prisoners and secured the trench, Churchill wiped his sword clean, though it had drawn no blood. He hadn't needed to kill anyone. The sword existed for something far more potent than violence. It existed to signal confidence so overwhelming it could override enemy logic. Later, when Malcolm reported the mission to headquarters, the commanding officer stared at him as though he were recounting a myth instead of a military engagement. 8 commandos capturing 40, 2 Germans without a single bullet. It sounded absurd. Malcolm described Churchill's strategy, the pipes, the commands, the illusion of battalion strength. The officer turned his gaze to Churchill, to the broadsword resting at his side. After a long pause, he said, "Lieutenant, this is the most insane tactical method I've ever heard." Churchill nodded without missing a beat and answered, "Yes, sir, but it worked." And for the rest of the war, commanders would struggle to understand how one man had turned psychological manipulation into a battlefield weapon more effective than any rifle. The commanding officer who reviewed Malcolm's after-action report struggled to decide whether Churchill should be commended or court-martialed. Everything Churchill had done, carrying an unauthorized weapon, ignoring standard doctrine, improvising tactics without approval, violated military procedure at a fundamental level. If another officer had attempted such madness and failed, he would have been removed from command instantly. But Churchill hadn't failed. He had delivered 40, 2 prisoners without a shot fired, without losing a single man, without spilling a drop of blood. Success that undeniable was impossible to punish. What Churchill achieved that night wasn't simply bravery, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He understood something most officers overlooked. Soldiers don't see reality. They see what their training prepares them to see. The Germans expected British commandos to fight like modern troops, using cover, suppressive fire, grenades, and coordinated assault lines. Churchill did the opposite. He strode into open ground, visible from every angle, producing noise when he should have been silent, calling attention when doctrine demanded concealment. This violation of expectation created cognitive dissonance so intense that German soldiers couldn't reconcile it fast enough to react. Their minds stalled. And in that moment of uncertainty, Churchill planted the crucial assumption that shaped their surrender. No one would behave this boldly unless they were leading overwhelming force. From that assumption, fear did the rest. The bagpipes, so primitive and out of place on a modern battlefield, added a mythic weight to his approach. His sword, gleaming under starlight, signaled a confidence that bordered on supernatural in the eyes of those watching. Every piece of his appearance was a deliberate contradiction to what German soldiers believed a commando should be. Because he violated their expectations completely, they trusted their own fear more than the evidence in front of them. If Churchill had shown even a sliver of doubt, the illusion would have collapsed instantly. But he didn't. His absolute, unwavering commitment made the Germans believe the lie they created in their own minds. Churchill didn't need to fire a shot. He let the enemy defeat themselves through their imagination. The darkness behind him also played a crucial role. It concealed his true numbers while amplifying the shouted orders of his men. Sound travels unpredictably at night. and the Germans heard echoes bouncing in ways that suggested dozens of voices. In reality, only 8 men were advancing, but in the confusion of fear, shadows and echoes distorted into phantom battalions. Churchill's sword symbolized everything that made the deception possible. A medieval weapon shouldn't exist in a 20th century battle, and its presence shattered the enemy's sense of normalcy. Seeing it forced them to consider explanations beyond their training. Was this man insane? Was he an officer supported by an elite assault force? Was this the opening act of a massive coordinated attack? Every answer, no matter how they reasoned, led them to the same conclusion: engaging Churchill was suicidal. This was not luck. This was not madness. This was theater sharpened into a weapon. Word of Churchill's victory and his past exploits traveled quickly through both the British and the German armies. By September 1943, German intelligence had compiled a detailed file on him. They knew his height, his build, his habit of carrying a longbow, the bagpipes, the sword. They tracked patterns in raids where blade wounds appeared. They documented survivors describing a wild British officer who charged alone with a medieval arsenal. The Germans issued guidance to frontline units. If they encountered a British officer with a sword and bagpipes, they were to assume a major assault was imminent. The instruction was simple: surrender if possible, do not attempt engagement. The legend of Mad Jack Churchill was no longer rumor. It had become doctrine on the German side, but the German fear that protected Churchill in Italy and France would not protect him forever. Reputations in war are double-edged. They intimidate some enemies, but they also motivate others to prepare more thoroughly. In May 1944, Churchill was reassigned to operations in Yugoslavia, where he would support Tito's partisan fighters against German occupation. The terrain was brutal, mountainous, riddled with villages destroyed by reprisals. German forces there were hardened, ruthless veterans. Partisans were skilled but poorly equipped. The British mission was to train them, supply them, and strike alongside them. The freedom of unconventional warfare suited Churchill perfectly. Partisans didn't care about British regulations. They valued results, and Churchill delivered results. In June 1944, he led a combined force of 40 British commandos and 60 partisans in a raid on a German supply depot near the island of Brac. Intelligence predicted around 100 German defenders, dangerous but manageable with a force of 100 attackers. Churchill planned the strike at dawn, counting on the chaos of early morning to amplify the shock. The initial assault was executed flawlessly. British commandos and partisans stormed the depot with explosions and close quarters ferocity. Germans scattered, buildings were seized, supplies were destroyed, documents were recovered. Everything unfolded exactly as Churchill intended, until the moment the real danger revealed itself. Reinforcements arrived. Not 100, but 300 German soldiers backed by armored cars, mortars, and machine gun teams, all under the command of a German officer who had read the intelligence files on Mad Jack Churchill. This commander, Major Ernst Vogel, was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man hardened by street fighting and siege warfare, a man who had survived hell and carried that ruthlessness with him. Vogel was not going to be intimidated by swords or bagpipes. He wasn't going to hesitate or second guess. He had come prepared to kill the legend. Within minutes, Churchill's force of 100 fighters was completely surrounded, cut off from escape routes, pinned inside stone walls that shuddered under mortar fire. The situation was hopeless. Churchill's radio operator attempted to call for evacuation, but there was no response. They were alone, trapped, facing triple their number with armor support. Churchill gathered his men, both British and partisan commanders, who expected him to suggest surrender. Logic said it was the only option. 300 Germans, armored cars, mortars, no reinforcements, no escape. Surrender would save lives. Churchill shook his head, he refused, and the legend marched forward again into the impossible. Churchill's refusal to surrender on the island of Brac was not bravado. It was the same relentless logic he had lived by since the start of the war. If the enemy expected you to choose one path, survival might lie in choosing the opposite. Now trapped inside a stone compound with 40 commandos and 60 partisan fighters, surrounded by 300 German troops supported by armored cars, mortars, and heavy machine guns, Churchill understood that surrender would mean execution for the partisans and imprisonment at best for British. Major Ernst Vogel, the German commander, was not a man who hesitated or showed mercy. He had fought in Russia and understood the brutality of war too well. If they surrendered, many would die slowly. If they fought defensively, the Germans would crush them under superior firepower. Churchill saw only one option that offered even a chance at survival: attack. When he gathered the partisan leaders and his own officers, the air was thick with disbelief. They expected him to raise a white flag. Instead, Churchill said, "We're going to charge." The words seemed insane. A seasoned partisan commander named Petter looked at him sharply, stunned into raw honesty. "If we charge, we'll die." Churchill nodded, not dismissing the truth, but embracing it. Yes, they might die, but surrender guaranteed it, and it guaranteed it for the civilians and freedom fighters depending on them. His voice sharpened with conviction. "If we surrender, they execute the partisans, and I don't surrender." That was the core of Churchill, yielding resolve wrapped in unbreakable logic. He laid out the plan quickly, knowing the Germans were tightening the perimeter with every minute. They had a brief window before Vogel completed his encirclement. The Germans were still setting up positions on the northern side, their weakest point. Churchill proposed a full-force breakout, no hesitation, every man running at full speed, using bayonets, grenades, rifles, knives, whatever they had. They would hit the Germans before the perimeter solidified, using shock as their only advantage. In close combat, the numbers might not matter for the critical 10 seconds needed to break through. "They expect us to surrender or defend," Churchill said. "They don't expect this." The charge would confuse the Germans long enough to open a gap, and from there each man would scatter into the hills. Some would die, some would live, but at least they would decide their own fate instead of letting Vogel decide it. The partisans exchanged looks, weighing madness against death. They had heard the stories about Mad Jack Churchill, the man with the sword, the pipes, the impossible victories. If Churchill said they had a chance, then maybe, just maybe, the insane could become possible. Churchill drew his sword, the same blade that had sent fear into German units across Europe. For the first time since Salerno, he knew he would truly need it. As mortar shells slammed into the compound walls and dust rained down from the beams above, the men prepared. At 06:42 hours, Churchill stepped out of the compound first, bagpipes on his shoulder, sword in his right fist. He began playing as he ran, an eerie, defiant tune that carried across the field like a war cry from another era. 100 fighters burst from the compound behind him. They ran straight at 300 German soldiers who believed they had the British trapped. In that first instant, the Germans froze. Their minds couldn't process what they were seeing. They had surrounded Churchill's force, pinned them down, cut off every escape route. Outnumbered 3-1, outgunned, boxed in, no sane commander would charge, not when defeat seemed certain. Yet here was an avalanche of men sprinting at them through smoke and shrapnel, bagpipes screaming above the chaos. Those 3 seconds of hesitation were exactly what Churchill had counted on. His fighters slammed into the German north perimeter like a hammer. Bayonets stabbed, rifle butts cracked bone, grenades detonated at point blank range. Close combat turned the battlefield into a maelstrom of screams, grit, blood, and raw survival. And in the center of the violence, Churchill fought like the warrior his sword had always demanded he become. His first strike cut down a German raising his rifle. A second sweep of the blade opened the chest of another who tried to block him. His third blow dropped a man who lunged with a bayonet. The Germans were horrified. They had prepared for machine gun fire, not a storm of steel and fury. A soldier jabbed at Churchill with his bayonet. Churchill parried effortlessly, his sword turning the blade aside, and countered with a slash that caught the man across the throat. Another German swung his rifle like a club. Churchill ducked, came up fast, and drove his sword into the man's ribs. There was nothing refined or theatrical about the way he fought now. It was industrial slaughter delivered with cold precision, every motion a testament to centuries of swordsmanship refined for killing armored men. The German line broke. Shock overwhelmed discipline. No one had trained for this. Churchill's force poured through the gap, scattering into the rocky hills. The Germans chased for a few hundred meters, shouting, firing shots wildly, but the will to pursue evaporated. They had just watched 100 surrounded fighters charge 300 defenders and carve a hole straight through them. No one wanted to follow Mad Jack Churchill into terrain he knew better than they did. When the shooting finally stopped, British casualties stood at 9 dead. Partisans had lost 14, 20, 3 men had fallen, but 70. 7 had escaped from a situation that should have killed all of them. They survived because Churchill refused to accept the rules of conventional warfare. In the chaos of that breakout, his sword proved its worth in the most brutal way possible. Modern weapons jammed, bayonets bent. Rifles became awkward clubs, but the broadsword, 3 feet of Scottish steel folded and forged to endure the crush of battle-per, formed exactly as it had for centuries. It cut clean, it never jammed, it never hesitated. It never ran out of ammunition. For 10 seconds of hell, Churchill's sword was the weapon that kept him and the men around him alive. And though they escaped that morning, Churchill's war was far from over. The legend grew, so did the dangers waiting for him. The Germans would not underestimate Mad Jack ever again. The breakout on Brack became one of the strangest and most improbable escapes of the entire war. A moment where sheer audacity beat numbers, firepower, and logic itself. But victory never came without a cost. 9 British commandos were dead, 14 partisans had fallen, and every survivor carried the bruises, cuts, and shock of a battle fought at arm's reach. Yet 77 lived because Churchill refused to allow the Germans to dictate the terms of their fate. For 10 brutal seconds, the sword he carried, dismissed by many as a theatrical prop, proved itself not as a relic but as a purpose-built instrument of close quarters destruction. In that narrow window where modern weapons jammed, where rifles turned to clubs and bayonets bent under pressure, Churchill's broadsword performed exactly as centuries of Scottish metallurgy intended. It sliced, parried, shattered, and broke the will of the men in front of him. German soldiers who had been trained to fight with machine guns and grenades were suddenly thrust into primitive warfare, a realm of steel and bone. And Churchill, unlike any man they had ever faced, thrived in it. The war, however, did not end with Brack. The legend of Mad Jack, already circulating in whispers and intelligence bulletins, grew with each encounter. Stories of a bagpipe, playing officer who charged into fire with a sword traveled across German lines, unsettling units, inspiring caution, and sometimes even panic. But intimidation cuts both ways. By early 1945, German commanders had learned that Churchill could not be engaged like a normal officer. You couldn't ambush him with a small force, couldn't assume his tactics, couldn't predict his movements. If they wanted to capture or eliminate him, they needed overwhelming force. And in April 1945, they brought exactly that. In northern Italy, Churchill led a 30-man commando group conducting standard harassment operations against retreating German units. They were experienced, skilled, and accustomed to danger. But on that day, they were unknowingly walking into a trap. 3 full German companies, hundreds of soldiers, moved into position around them. Churchill's unit fought for 6 relentless hours, pinned between rising slopes and advancing troops, unable to break free, running low on ammunition as the Germans tightened their grip. The terrain turned against them, trenches offering little shelter, their flanks collapsing under pressure. Churchill directed his men with precision, ordering controlled fire, tactical withdrawal, reposition. In classic commando discipline honed by years of combat, but it wasn't enough. The numbers were impossible. One by one, his men fell back, their ammunition dwindling, grenades were gone, magazines nearly empty. Smoke and dust from German mortar shells blurred the air as the perimeter shrank inch by inch. By midday, almost half of Churchill's men were casualties. Those still fighting clutched their last bullets. Churchill understood the situation perfectly. When ammunition runs out, doctrine collapses, tactics evaporate, survival becomes a matter of will, and Churchill's instinct, the instinct that had defined his entire war, was to act, not wait. When the moment came, when the last magazines clicked empty and German soldiers advanced with rifles fixed, Churchill did what no manual would ever advise. He drew his sword. With nothing left to lose and no bullets left to fire, he lifted the blade that had carried him through missions in France, Italy, Norway, and Yugoslavia. Then he charged, alone, straight at a German position manned by soldiers who had been warned never to engage the man with the sword lightly. Even then, even with overwhelming force on their side, the sight of Churchill rushing at them with steel in hand rattled the Germans. He cut down 4 of them with the same brutal efficiency he had shown at Brac and Salerno. His blade arced through smoke, through shouts, through desperation, but no amount of courage or fury could overcome 3 German companies. A rifle butt smashed across his back, sending him collapsing into mud and rubble. When Churchill awoke, he was bound in the back of a German truck. His sword was gone. His hands were tied. Around him sat German soldiers who stared at him as though unsure he was even real. The officer in charge, who spoke English, finally broke the silence and told Churchill that German High Command wanted to interrogate the famous British officer with the sword. They needed to know whether he was a single madman or part of some larger British psychological operation. Churchill didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He was transported to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, placed in a high, you prisoners section usually reserved for important political captives and intelligence assets. Even in captivity, the Germans treated him with a strange mixture of fear and respect. Officers visited him, asking if the stories were true, if he really played bagpipes into machine gun fire, if he really used a longbow, if he truly captured 2 Germans alone. Churchill confirmed everything with the same calm certainty he had shown in the field. The commandant didn't know whether to admire him or fear him. Churchill, being Churchill, refused to sit quietly. He escaped not once, but twice. The first time, he slipped past a fence during a blackout and walked more than 200 kilometers through German territory, heading steadily toward Allied lines. He was recaptured barely 15 miles from safety. They moved him to tighter security, but Churchill was already planning a 3rd escape when the war ended. In May 1945, Germany surrendered and Churchill was liberated. A journalist later asked him what he thought about the war ending. Churchill, half joking and half disappointed, replied, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years." It was the most Churchill answer possible, part humor, part frustration, all spirit. He stayed in the British Army until 1959, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. Through all of it, the sword never left his side. And even though the war ended, the legend of the man who carried medieval weapons into modern battles continued to grow, inspiring soldiers, terrifying enemies, and reshaping how the world understood psychological warfare. The sword did not make Churchill famous. Churchill made the sword immortal. In the quiet aftermath of the war, when nations tried to make sense of the madness that had consumed the world, the British Army finally addressed the legacy of the man who had carried a medieval sword into the age of machine guns. In 1946, the Army officially authorized officers to carry swords in combat, not because High Command believed the practice was practical or advisable, but because they could not figure out how to stop Churchill from doing it. His defiance had become doctrine by sheer force of personality. Throughout his career, Churchill had demonstrated something that no military textbook had ever captured. That war is as much about perception as it is about firepower. Churchill lived to be 80, 9 years old, passing away in 1996, and at his funeral more than 200 veterans gathered to honor him. Men who had fought beside him in France, Norway, Italy, and Yugoslavia stood shoulder to shoulder, remembering not just the battles, but the impossible acts of courage they had witnessed. Many had survived because Churchill taught them what no manual could: how to weaponize unpredictability. Today, Churchill's sword rests behind glass in the Imperial War Museum, displayed beside his bagpipes and longbow. The plaque beneath it reads, Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe, Fleming Churchill, DSO and Bar, MC and Bar. The only British soldier confirmed to have killed enemy troops with a longbow and a sword during World War II. But the plaque, like most museum summaries, tells only the surface of the story. It does not describe how Churchill shattered one of the core assumptions of modern warfare, that technology alone wins battles. It does not explain how he manipulated enemy expectations so thoroughly that entire units surrendered to imaginary forces. It does not capture the brilliance of a man who understood that psychology, fear, doubt, uncertainty, can be deadlier than any weapon. Churchill mastered the art of expectation. Every army in the world trains its soldiers to fight predictable enemies. Enemies with rifles, grenades, mortars, and tactics that fit neatly into familiar patterns. Doctrine teaches soldiers how to respond to standard threats. But nothing in German training prepared them for a British officer who stepped into open terrain playing bagpipes instead of firing a gun, who carried a longbow through forests in France, who charged into fire with a broadsword raised high. When German soldiers saw Churchill, their brains searched for explanations that didn't exist. Was he insane? Was he the leader of an elite force? Was he announcing the arrival of overwhelming reinforcements? Their training did not account for this anomaly, so doubt filled the gap. Doubt destroyed discipline, and hesitation, whether 3 seconds or 7 minutes, was enough for Churchill to take victory from situations that should have ended in disaster. 42 Germans surrendered at Salerno not because they lacked courage, but because Churchill manipulated their expectations so completely that they could no longer trust what their eyes were telling them. They believed there had to be hundreds of troops behind him, even though the truth was just 7 commandos shouting into the dark. That is not madness, that is tactical genius. Churchill's sword acted as more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a message broadcast directly into the enemy's subconscious. A man who brings a medieval blade into a gunfight is either completely unhinged or completely certain of victory. Either way, he becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability is the enemy of rational combat decisions. When the Germans saw that sword, they imagined the worst-case scenario because their training provided no other lens. Their minds built armies where none existed. They turned 8 men into a battalion, a lone officer into a terrifying myth. Churchill didn't need to fire a shot. The Germans defeated themselves. Modern military forces still study his methods. Psychological operations manuals reference principles that echo Churchill's tactics, without naming him. They teach the importance of symbols, expectations, and manipulating the enemy's perception. They stress that when soldiers encounter something their training cannot explain, fear fills the void, that fear can be turned into paralysis or surrender. Churchill demonstrated this long before the term asymmetric warfare became common. He weaponized identity. He used the bizarre to destabilize the predictable, and he did it in a way that reshaped military thinking across generations. The plaque at the Imperial War Museum doesn't mention any of this. It mentions the longbow, the sword, the medals. But next to that glass case sits the truth. Churchill rewrote the rules of combat. He proved that a man who breaks every expectation becomes impossible to counter. He taught the world that war is not just about bullets and steel, but about the human mind. German troops who surrendered to him were not weak. They were victims of a master manipulator who understood their training better than they did. And because he understood it, he could dismantle it. As visitors walk past Churchill's sword today, many pause, reading the plaque and shaking their heads in disbelief. To some, the story sounds like folklore, too outrageous to be real. Yet the sword is there, the bagpipes are there, the longbow is there, preserved pieces of a legacy that should have been impossible. but impossible was Churchill's specialty. What the museum cannot show is the sound of those pipes echoing across a battlefield, the tense silence of German soldiers trying to understand what they were seeing, the moment their certainty collapsed beneath the weight of doubt. It cannot show the mental shift that made 2 men surrender without a single shot fired. But if you stand in front of that display long enough, if you imagine the dark fields of Salerno or the chaos of Brac, you might understand the lesson Churchill left behind. Victory does not always belong to the strongest army, or the best equipped, or the best trained. Sometimes it belongs to the man who refuses to fight by the rules. Churchill didn't bring a sword to a gunfight because he was reckless. He brought it because he understood something deeper. When you make the enemy question everything they know, their strength becomes weakness. Their doctrine becomes a prison. Their fear becomes your weapon. And that is why 2 Germans surrendered in 7 minutes to 1 man with a broadsword and a set of bagpipes. Churchill didn't just carry weapons, he carried a legend, and legends, when wielded correctly, win wars. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.